I want you to calm down and take a deep breath, because today's story is really special. Relax, inhale deeply, and get ready to dive into an amazing tale. The mid-3rd century weren't exactly cozy blanket weather, unless you count a damp wool cloak that smells faintly of sheep and smoke. This was the age when the Black Death swept across Europe, snuffing out entire villages, cramming plague pits with bodies, and leaving behind a silence so thick you could hear your own heart hammering in your ears. Quick thing before we dive in. If you enjoy these stories, hit like and subscribe. It really helps me out and helps this new channel reach 50k subscribers this month. Drop a comment and tell me where you're tuning in from and what time it is there. The first thing that hits you when you step into a town just after the worst wave of the plague isn't silence. It's the smell. The streets are still, unnaturally so, but the air clings to you, heavy with the sharp tang of lime, the bitter trace of ash, and something far more unsettling that you can't quite name. People had tried to cleanse their cities with fire, with burning herbs, even splashing vinegar on doorways in desperate acts of faith and science. But no amount of smoke or prayer can mask the memory of tens of thousands gone. Wooden shutters hang crooked from rusted hinges. Half-eaten loaves of bread sit fossilized on abandoned tables. Cats roam the alleys like kings, fat from an endless feast of spilled grain and, let's be honest, the occasional unlucky rat. You walk deeper into the town. Rows of houses stand like hollow shells, their darkness broken only by a flicker here and there, a single candle burning in a window, proof that someone inside has survived. The sight should be comforting, but it isn't. Because you know that 2/3 of your neighbors are dead, and the few who remain eye you with suspicion, as if you might be carrying the next invisible wave of doom. The streets don't just look empty, they sound empty. Even gossip, Europe's favorite pastime, has fallen silent. The world feels muted, like a play where most of the actors have vanished, and no one knows how to continue the scene. Here's the hard truth. By the early 1350s, some cities, like Florence, had lost up to 60% of their people. Entire professions collapsed overnight. Whole family lines were erased. Chroniclers wrote of fields left unplowed, mills standing idle, and church bells tolling until their ropes frayed and snapped from overuse. And yet, among the despair, strange stories began to circulate. Some writers claimed that wild animals were moving back in, wolves creeping closer to Paris than ever before, bold enough to test the edges of the city now that fewer humans stood in their way. Others spoke of pigs living like royalty in deserted villages. Imagine it. Empty barns, no rent, scraps and grain left behind in abundance. A medieval pig paradise. Almost like a strange barnyard festival in the ruins of civilization. Were these stories true? Scholars still debate it. Some argue they were exaggerated. Grim little campfire tales meant to make the emptiness feel even more dramatic. Others believe there's a kernel of truth, that the balance between nature and man really did shift for a generation, even if it wasn't quite as dramatic as wolf packs prowling Paris. But even if the details were exaggerated, the feeling was real. Europe had become wild again, silent, unpredictable, dangerous. And the quiet wasn't just physical, it was emotional. Survivors carried an invisible weight. Laughter felt like an endangered species. Priests struggled to console their flocks because everyone had watched prayers fail again and again in real time. Neighbors averted their eyes in the streets, and sometimes, in that heavy stillness, you could almost hear faint echoes of old processions, the penitents who had once marched through these very squares, whipping themselves bloody in hopes that their suffering might end the plague. Most of them were gone now, but their memory hung in the air like smoke. And here's something even stranger. Survival itself had become suspicious. Imagine standing at your doorway, your family still alive, while the house next to you sits dark and silent. Would others envy you or fear you? Whispers began to spread, tales of witches, hidden healers, or families secretly blessed by divine favor. Superstition mixed with bitterness, until every surviving household became a mystery, a potential threat. Luck wasn't seen as luck anymore. It was politics. It shaped who trusted whom, who allied with whom, and who plotted revenge in the years to come. And as you walk down those cobblestone lanes, you can almost feel the shift. This isn't just a place of mourning. It's a place of calculation. Behind those shuttered windows, people are already tallying land, inheritance, and opportunity. Every empty house is both a grave marker and a windfall. Society has cracked wide open, but in the silence, the first gears of human ambition are beginning to turn again. The quiet isn't just an ending, it's the beginning of what comes next. But for now, you keep walking. Each step echoes like a drumbeat in a ghost town. The streets feel like a haunted stage, stripped of its actors. And then, faintly, you hear something new. The scrape of shovels, the groan of wooden cartwheels sinking into mud. You follow the sound, and it leads you to the edge of town. Here the living labor for the dead. Fresh earth piles high beside yawning pits. Graves stretch in rows like open mouths, some hurriedly dug, others marked with rough-hewn wooden crosses. Figures wrapped in patched cloaks heave another body onto a cart. Their faces are stone, not just from grief, but from exhaustion, from the sheer monotony of death. After a while, mourning stops being mourning. It becomes work. And then even work becomes silent. The records tell us cemeteries overflowed so quickly that whole fields had to be converted into burial grounds. In London, new graveyards appeared almost overnight. In Florence, massive pits were dug, wide enough to swallow thousands at once. Bodies were layered one atop another, each dusted with lime to cut the stench and slow the contagion. Survivors spent weeks burying their neighbors, until grief became as routine as breaking stale bread. And still, amid the earth and sweat, strange whispers linger. Stories of ghostly processions, shapes glimpsed at dusk, cloaked figures carrying torches that give off no light. Phantoms walking the same roads as the living, a reminder that even in death, the town is never truly empty. Some swear that the dead rise from their mass graves to wander back into town, searching for the homes they left behind. It's not just fairy tale chatter. Folklore after the Black Death exploded with these kinds of ghost stories, tales of revenants who carried disease in their wake, of lost children seen at windows long after their bodies were buried. People carved strange protective symbols onto their doors, hoping to keep wandering spirits at bay. Here's the quirky fact. Some priests actually recommended that bells keep ringing, not just for the living, but to guide the souls of the dead. Imagine a village with no mass, no choir, but still this lonely metallic ringing echoing across the countryside. A sound both practical and spectral. Bells were believed to calm the restless dead and reassure the living that some order remained even when everything else felt unhinged. Of course, scholars debate how much of this ghost lore was a coping mechanism and how much was genuine belief. Were these stories ways of making sense of grief, putting familiar faces back into a world suddenly emptied of them? Or did people really believe the veil between the living and the dead had thinned? That the plague was proof heaven and hell had spilled into the streets? Some historians argue ghost tales were a form of resistance. If the church couldn't explain the plague, maybe the villagers would craft their own narrative. Others see it as the medieval equivalent of horror films, terrifying but oddly cathartic for you. Standing at the edge of the pit, the atmosphere feels thick enough to believe either story. Survivors work in silence until a low wind rustles through the weeds, and suddenly every shovel pauses. People glance around, eyes darting toward the shadow of the trees. For a moment, you think they're about to run, but then someone spits, mutters a prayer, and the digging resumes. You realize that this fear has become a rhythm. Pause, pray, push forward. That's survival in its most stripped-down form. As night falls, the graveyard becomes stranger. Still, lanterns bob like fireflies in the dark as the diggers retreat, leaving behind rows of fresh earth that steam in the cool air. You hear a dog bark, then whimper, before silence folds in again. From the town, faint music drifts. Someone is playing a stringed instrument, probably more to keep despair away than to entertain. And in that thin thread of music, you can sense how people cling to life, even with graves still open and waiting. The plague has made ghosts of everyone, even the living. People carry themselves differently now, as if stepping lightly so the earth won't notice them. Every glance over the shoulder carries the weight of superstition. And yet, through the digging and the bells and the whispered tales of spirits, something sturdier emerges, a determination not to let the dead rule forever. By the time you leave the graveyards behind, your path leads you to manors and castles that once radiated power, but now stand hollow. Their banners hang limp, their gates unnervingly quiet. The plague had no respect for titles. It struck kings and commoners alike. Within these walls, entire noble lineages had been erased in a matter of months. Great halls that once rang with music and laughter now echo only with the caw of ravens perched high in the rafters. Inheritance papers lie unsealed on dusty tables, waiting for hands that will never sign them. 1,000 years of carefully guarded bloodlines snuffed out almost overnight. The historical reality is startling. Aristocratic families collapsed so quickly that, in some regions, Europe teetered on the edge of political chaos. In England, vast estates passed to distant cousins who had never dreamed of wearing fine cloaks or commanding retainers. In Italy, the fall of ancient dynasties opened doors for ambitious merchant families to seize power. The Black Death didn't just thin the population, it tore holes in the very structure of governance. Kings lost their counselors, lords lost their heirs, and suddenly power spilled into the streets like coins scattered from a torn purse. And where there are loose coins, there is always ambition. Survivors with even the faintest family tie to a fallen house scrambled to prove their lineage. Forgeries of family trees flourished. Priests were bribed to remember forgotten cousins who supposedly had the right to inherit entire estates. Opportunistic marriages sprang up overnight. Widows and widowers became the most desirable figures in town, pursued not for love, but for land. A knight who yesterday had nothing but a rusting sword could, with a single well-timed marriage, inherit lands stretching farther than he could ride in a day. And here's the strange twist. Records tell of children barely 2 or 3 years old suddenly becoming the legal owners of vast estates. Picture a toddler in swaddling clothes who technically rules a castle while their nursemaid makes every decision behind the scenes. These child lords and ladies were figureheads, symbols for adults who eagerly pulled the strings. Some historians jokingly call this Europe's kindergarten nobility phase. But just how chaotic these successions were is still debated. Some argue that medieval bureaucracy, though clumsy, held together surprisingly well. Others believe the Black Death caused a genuine rupture, forcing new experiments in power. Experiments that would one day shape centralized monarchies and the rise of the bourgeoisie. For you wandering through the echoing halls of an abandoned castle, the debate feels far from academic. You can almost see the banquets that once filled this space. Candles dripping wax onto oak tables, minstrels strumming lutes, gossip flying faster than arrows. Now the table is dust-covered. Plates lie stacked and forgotten. A half-empty goblet tilts on its side, never to be refilled. The silence here feels heavier than in the graveyard. It's the silence of lost authority. Outside the gates, peasants glance at the castle with a mix of fear and curiosity. Do they still bow when they pass? Or do their eyes flicker with a dangerous question? What if the rules are different now? You can almost hear the gears turning in their minds. For centuries, loyalty had been drilled into them like a prayer. But now, with noble bloodlines cut short, there is room for boldness. A vacuum of power is also an invitation, and you begin to notice something subtle. The survivors aren't just grieving, they're reimagining. Widows no longer simply guard estates, they negotiate, trade, and scheme. Young men who once expected nothing as third sons now find themselves courted by powerful households. Even servants, freed from the watchful eyes of their masters, stand a little taller, as if breathing air that feels newly their own. But this freedom comes with unease. No one knows whether tomorrow will bring order or civil war. Will alliances form peacefully, or will daggers flash in the dark? For now, the castles remain like empty husks of a fading world, waiting for someone brave or reckless enough to claim them. Beyond the castle walls, the silence changes texture. Out here in the open countryside, it's measured not by echoes, but by the wind stirring untended fields. Tall, golden wheat bends under the breeze, only to wither where no hand comes to harvest it. You step into what should be a farmer's paradise, fertile fields ripe for the taking. But there are no farmers. Weeds climb through furrows. Oxen wander feral among broken barns. The plague didn't just kill people, It unplugged the entire agricultural engine that kept bread on the table. For the hungry survivors, every wasted ear of grain is a reminder. Survival is about to get complicated. The historical reality is stark. In the years immediately following the Black Death, food production collapsed. Entire villages were emptied, leaving crops to rot and livestock to roam untended. Chroniclers wrote of dogs feasting on cattle carcasses, of pastures turning wild, hedges creeping into once tidy fields, orchards twisting back into wilderness. At first glance, this should have meant mass famine. But here's the paradox. With half the population gone, there were fewer mouths to feed. Hunger existed, yes, but unevenly. Some regions starved, while others had more food than anyone could eat. And here's the quirky bit. In certain parts of England, peasants dined better than they ever had before. Meat, cheese, ale, once hoarded by nobles, were suddenly plentiful. Imagine a farmhand who once survived on thin gruel, now eating mutton 3 times a week. To some, it felt like divine justice, as though God himself had shuffled the table settings of Europe. But historians still argue about just how widespread this prosperity really was. Some insist it was limited to certain lucky pockets, while many others still struggled. Markets were closed, mills unmanned, roads unsafe. Even in abundance, fear hung heavy. Everyone knew the plague could return at any moment and empty the table once again. Walking through these fields, the contradiction is everywhere. One farmhouse bustles with life. Fat geese strutting in the yard. A farmer salting pork with a satisfied grin. A mile down the road, another house sits in ruins, its doors swinging open, the orchard stripped bare by desperate hands. Hunger and plenty now live side by side, like two neighbors who never speak but share the same fence. And with this comes bargaining. For centuries, landowners had dictated the terms. But now, with so much land lying idle and too few workers to till it, the balance of power flipped. Laborers realized they had leverage. A plowman who once begged for scraps could now demand wages or simply walk away to a lord more desperate. Imagine standing in a muddy field, hoe in hand, and realizing for the first time that you, a dirt-streaked peasant, can name your price. Hardship didn't vanish. Poverty and fear still ruled many lives. But in the cracks of the old order, opportunity began to grow like wild weeds. You watch a group of men haggling with a nervous steward at the edge of a manor field. The steward sweats, glancing toward the empty house behind him, before finally agreeing to pay wages in coin instead of food. The peasants grin. That single handshake carries the faint heartbeat of revolution, the first small fracture in unquestioned feudal obedience. But unease lingers. Too much food in one place, too little in another, too much land, too few hands. The imbalance hums like a storm on the horizon. The fields are no longer just places of labor. They are mirrors of a society breaking apart, reshaping itself into something crooked and new. You follow the sound of raised voices into a village square. Here, the quiet desperation of the fields has transformed into something louder, almost rebellious. A crowd stands before the steward, arms crossed, boots caked in mud. And this isn't a pleading crowd, it's a bargaining one. Scarcity has rewritten the rules. The most disposable people in the kingdom, the peasants, are now the most valuable. The Black Death didn't just kill. It inflated wages like a balloon ready to burst. The records are clear. In the years after the plague, wages across Europe soared. In England, some agricultural wages nearly doubled within a decade. Artisans, masons, and carpenters demanded and got rates that would have stunned their fathers. Chroniclers complained bitterly. Common folk were dressing above their station, eating too well and even refusing to work unless their terms were met. Imagine medieval bosses ranting about lazy workers while peasants bought better shoes. Here's the quirky twist. Some lords tried bribery instead of raw pay raises. Extra ale rations, new cloaks, even fishing rights in the manor pond were offered as perks. One account describes a landowner so desperate for help that he promised his workers both wages and hunting privileges, something unheard of before. In their own way, medieval peasants invented the benefits package. But was this truly revolutionary? Historians still debate it. Some argue the wage boom was quickly stifled by laws like England's Statute of Labourers in 1351, which tried to freeze pay at pre-plague levels. Others believe those laws were doomed to fail, like trying to nail water to a wall. Once peasants had tasted power, they couldn't forget it. These struggles were the opening notes of a long symphony that would eventually lead toward capitalism, labor rights, and modern economies. Still, it wasn't a straight line. Many workers were fined, threatened, even beaten when they pushed too far. The battle for wages was dangerous. In the square, the steward waves a parchment decree, insisting wages stay fixed. A farmhand cracks a joke about how parchment doesn't plow fields. The crowd chuckles, low and dangerous. You can feel the air change, the moment when ordinary people realize their worth. The irony is sharp. Many lords are just as desperate as their workers. With heirs dead and debts mounting, they can't afford to lose what few laborers they have. Some give in reluctantly. Others tighten their grip with curfews, punishments, and chains. The tug of war grows brutal, but for the first time, peasants have leverage, and some are willing to risk everything to use it. You pass a group of women hauling grain baskets. One winks at you knowingly. They've always carried the weight of survival, but now their labor has bargaining power too. The village hums with tension. It stands balanced on the edge of two worlds, the old one of obedience and a new one of negotiation. By nightfall, the steward has caved. The workers leave with heavier pockets and lighter steps. You remain, knowing you've witnessed more than a simple haggling match. This is the faint beginning of a social revolution. The plague may have broken everything, but in its rubble, workers are building something new. And somewhere faintly, you can almost hear the sound of coins clinking and the steady heartbeat of change. Before the plague, these guilds were like little empires inside the city walls, controlling who could practice a craft, how much could be charged, and who got to rise through the ranks from apprentice to master. But now, with so many masters and journeymen gone, the whole system is wobbling like a stool with one leg sawed too short. Historically, the Black Death hammered guilds almost as much as it did farms. In places like Florence and Paris, half of some guild membership simply vanished. Shops stood shuttered. Apprentices were orphaned. Elaborate guild feasts dwindled to a handful of survivors sitting around an oversized table. Some guilds tried to cling to tradition, rewriting rules so tightly that entry was restricted to keep standards high. Others flung their doors open, desperate for warm bodies, letting in workers who a decade earlier would have been turned away. Suddenly, someone with a little skill and a lot of luck could leapfrog into positions that once required years of grinding. Here's the quirky detail. Some guilds took their survival rituals to odd extremes. In Nuremberg, the Butchers' Guild reportedly carried out elaborate public processions where they paraded around dressed in blood-smeared aprons, both as a show of strength and as a reminder of their sacrifice. In Venice, glassmakers, already treated like rock stars of the medieval world, tightened their ranks so much after the plague that some surviving families guarded their glass bee-blowing secrets with a paranoia that bordered on comedy. If you sneeze near a glassmaker, they might suspect espionage. The scholarly debate is sharp here. Did the Black Death weaken guilds permanently or make them more powerful? Some historians argue that cracks in guild systems after the plague let in new energy, new workers, new techniques that paved the way for Renaissance innovation. Others believe the guilds doubled down, becoming more conservative, stifling creativity and trying to free society in a kind of amber. Even today, the evidence swings both ways, depending on the city you look at. In Florence, guilds helped sponsor stunning new art and architecture. In smaller towns, they oified, locking out outsiders even harder. For you strolling through this half-empty guild street, the tension is palpable. A cobbler stares bitterly at the empty stall across from him, once owned by his rival. Now he grumbles that the rival's apprentice has dared to open his own shop, skipping all the rules of guild apprenticeship. Down the street, a group of surviving journeymen huddle, whispering about forming a brotherhood of their own, free from guild masters entirely. You can almost feel the system bending and cracking under the strain of survival. And then there's the human side. Guilds were not just businesses, but social safety nets. Members paid into funds to support widows, bury the dead, and feed orphans. With so many members gone, those funds were drained overnight. Some widows petitioned to keep running shops in their husbands' names, and surprisingly, many were allowed. Picture a woman behind the forge hammering iron with soot on her face, while officials mutter that it's irregular but necessary. The world of work has been cracked open, and the guilds are scrambling to decide whether to glue it back together or let it reshape itself. As the evening bells toll, you notice that the street has a strange hum to it, not bustling, but restless. Craftsmen sharpen their tools as if sharpening arguments. Apprentices glance nervously at half-empty guild halls, and widows count coins in their palms. The guilds may survive, but they won't look the same again. And you can't shake the sense that here in these crooked alleys, the seeds of both conflict and creativity are quietly being hammered into place. Leaving behind the cities and their squabbling guilds, you follow the dusty roads where the real aftermath of the plague plays out in motion. Survivors are wandering. Some trudge alone, faces hidden under hoods. Others move in ragged clusters like caravans without banners. It feels like the entire social order has spilled out of its boxes. Former tenants abandon empty villages to search for richer lands. Craftsmen sling their tools over their shoulders, hoping to find a town desperate enough to pay them double. Even children trail along with makeshift packs, following rumors of food and safety. Europe has become a continent of drifters. Historically, this was one of the great migrations of the Middle Ages. The Black Death didn't just empty villages, it loosened the glue that kept people tied to their lords and towns. Laws forbade peasants from leaving, but with whole communities gone, who was left to enforce them? In England, records show entire hamlets deserted, their houses collapsing back into the earth. In Germany, lost villages became a common phrase, and even today, archaeologists stumble across ghost settlements erased in the 14th century. It wasn't just people moving. It wasn't just land being abandoned. It was being reimagined. A curious thing happened in the aftermath. Wanderers earned the glow of folk heroes. Ballads praised masterless men and women, roving hands who refused to settle, drifting from manor to manor and demanding better pay. Lords cursed them as troublemakers. Peasants whispered admiration, the way you'd secretly cheer an outlaw who robs the sheriff and vanishes by dusk. One English chronicler even grumbled that these bands spent more time drinking and dancing than working, a complaint that sounds suspiciously like envy. But how much freedom did these wanderers really have? Some see them as trailblazers, shaking off feudal chains and proving that mobility could buy opportunity. Others argue their lives were precarious, hounded by sheriffs, fined, beaten, and shoved back into servitude when caught. Empowerment or desperation dressed as freedom. The truth sat somewhere in between, liberation for some, misery for many. You watch a small group at a crossroads. Two young men with scythes slung across their backs, a woman balancing a child on her hip, an old man with a lute over his shoulder. They argue under a weathered signpost, Flanders, where wages are rumored high, or Burgundy, where abandoned farms lie waiting. The old man plucks a teasing chord, mocking their solemnity. Then they move on together, laughter rubbing uneasily against the crunch of boots. The road itself is a ledger. Inns overflow with travelers swapping intelligence. Which lord pays in coin, which sends guards to drive workers off. Bridges are edged with little shrines, candles guttering for those who didn't survive plague or hunger. Bones lie in ditches, animal not always, but enough to remind you that wandering is dangerous, and yet staying put feels worse. By nightfall, the roads turn into marketplaces of suspicion and opportunity. A merchant caravan rattles past, heavily guarded against thieves and desperate beggars. Two men in patched tunics stop you. Any work in the next town? Their eyes are sharp and tired and burning with a new, frightening kind of hope. Mobility itself has become currency. The right to walk away from a lord-ass land and choose another life that his power peasants never had before. Under a hedge, drifting into sleep among other travelers, you hear Europe's chorus, bootsteps, creaking wheels, quiet bargains in a dozen tongues, a continent in motion, unsure where it's going, certain it cannot stay still. When you return to the towns, the sound has changed. Sermons crack from pulpits, bells toll at odd hours, confession lines trail like bread queues. The church is everywhere, and shakier than you've ever seen it. You slip into a cathedral, expecting the cushion of ritual. Instead, a priest's voice wavers like a candle in a draught. The Black Death has rattled the foundations. People don't come for answers. They've watched the old answers fail. They come for scraps of reassurance, for some sign that God hasn't turned his face away. Historically, the church staggered. Priests fled at the height of infection. Monasteries were emptied. Whole parishes went months without the sacraments. Survivors remembered. Trust fractured. Chroniclers complained that barely literate replacements were rushed into the gaps. The clergy remained powerful, but its credibility was punctured. You can feel the unease buzzing like flies around the altar, and desperation bred spectacle. In some towns, priests paraded relics through the streets, shards of saints' bones, splinters of the true cross, even angel feathers. If prayers failed, perhaps objects would work. These processions were half devotion, half theatre, with people weeping as the relics swayed by, hoping a scrap of holiness could dam the flood of death. Did the plague truly weaken the church for good? The scholars argue. Some say it planted seeds for later reform, Wycliffe, Hus, Luther, by cracking blind obedience. Others insist the church, bruised but unbowed, remained the spine of European life for centuries. Hairline cracks or fault lines, choose your metaphor. Sitting on a stone pew, the debate feels personal. A priest thunders that sin brought the pestilence. An old woman mutters about rats and foul air. Two young men roll their eyes. Prayers didn't keep their families alive. Faith persists, but brittle, challenged in whispers and sometimes in shouts. Yet the rituals multiply. Baptisms, parents terrified to leave children spiritually bare. Weddings, widows and widowers racing to steady their households. Funerals, endless. The church is both indispensable and vulnerable. A cracked pillar still holding the roof. Outside, contradictions collide. Pilgrims light candles with wet faces. A few steps away, boys snicker that saintly bones are just old sticks. The air smells of incense and doubt. Listen closely. The bells aren't the only sound. There are whispers in taverns, in fields by candlelight. Not obedience. Dissent. With so many clerics gone and trust frayed, radical ideas root in the cracks like weeds through cobbles. Under a tree, a peasant speaks with a dangerous brightness. Maybe God isn't punishing us. Maybe the priests are wrong. Maybe the church has failed. Heresy suddenly feels touchable. History bears it out. Suspicion toward clergy fueled small but growing movements. In England, Wycliffe would soon challenge the church's wealth and place scripture above priests. In Bohemia, Huss would light similar fires. Even earlier, the Lollards and remnants of Waldensians and Cathars found new listeners. Mass death made people braver, or more reckless, about questioning sanctity. A chronicler claims that in the Low Countries, makeshift preachers held up bread or even stones, declaring them as holy as any jeweled relic. Imagine a muddy field, a barefoot man raising a rock and saying, "This is as near to God as the bishop's chalice." To the desperate, revelation. To authorities, blasphemy. Was the plague the spark, or just fuel for embers already burning? Economic injustice, clerical excess, political rot. Historians split hairs. The effect was the same. The whispers spread. The church noticed. You see the risk. The man under the tree drops his voice when a friar passes. Heads nod, but eyes scan the road. Hunger for new ideas wearing with fear of the stake. In a market, two women mutter that indulgences are purchased lies, then laugh too loudly and barter apples like sealing a pact. Faith hasn't vanished. It's shifting. People still need meaning. But instead of looking only upward, they begin to look sideways, to neighbors, to lay preachers, to underground gatherings. Some cling tighter to orthodoxy, terrified of doom. Others step into rebellion, convinced God must be found outside gilded walls. By night, the tavern swells with low voices, a laborer pounding the table. Priests grow fat while peasants starve, and a merchant warning that such talk buys chains. Europe is no longer spiritually uniform. The whisper is swelling. At dawn, a different murmur rises, not from taverns or pulpits, but from classrooms. You slip into a drafty hall, a handful of students bent over desks, quills scratching while a weary master paces. The plague gutted universities as surely as guilds and monasteries, Oxford, Paris, Bologna. Enrollments plummeted, colleges shuttered, libraries thickened with dust. And yet, here they are, stitching learning back together, one ink blot at a time. Scarcity brings opportunity. With fewer scholars, the ambitious climb faster. Programs shorten, pushing students into civil offices, courts, and infirmaries to plug the holes. A degree that once took a decade can be had in half the time. Another twist. With teachers gone, students start teaching each other. In Bologna, young scholars pool notes, forming rough study circles, arguing Aristotle over ale in lamplit taverns. Hierarchies loosen. Knowledge no longer only flows downward, it passes sideways like bread shared around a table. Did the plague truly change education, or only jolt it? Some say it nudged Europe toward practical, career-driven learning, the proto-modern university churning out bureaucrats and physicians. Others argue the core endured. Latin lectures, memorization, scholastic duels over theology that could last days. Either way, cracks appeared, and through them, light. You can see it. One student copies a treatise on astronomy, convinced the heavens, not sermons, might explain disease. Another sketches bones in the margins, stealing glances from secret dissections. The master drones about the four humours. Half the room is already thinking beyond humours and beyond Aristotle. Libraries become strange marketplaces. With owners dead, books scatter, sold off or simply taken. Merchants who once cared little for vellum now buy whole collections for prestige or curiosity. Either way, the volumes move. Monastery to townhouse, to minds that read with fresh eyes. And the human note, a boy sneezes. The room freezes. The memory of plague is so raw that a sniffle tightens every jaw. The master crosses himself and continues, but the tension lingers. Every lesson feels provisional, every word inked with the weight of survival. Knowledge itself seems fragile, balancing on the thin edge of erasure. By evening, students spill into the street smelling of ink and damp wool. They look more like wanderers than scholars, but there's a spark there. They aren't just keeping knowledge alive, they're reshaping it, letting ideas creep into new corners, allowing thought to breed where no one expected. And somewhere in the shuffle of their feet, in the rasp of their quills, you hear the same refrain that hums through fields, castles, roads, and churches. The old order cracked, and through the cracks, something new is growing. The plague tried to silence Europe's classrooms, but in the scratch of those quills, you hear the stubborn refusal of learning to die. The scratching of quills fades behind you, and soon you find yourself in a much stranger place, a cluttered chamber where books and bones share the same shelves. It smells of wax, ink, and something faintly sour, like old earth. This is not a tidy university library. It's the domain of survivors who became unlikely heroes of the rebuilding era. Scribes, collectors, and even the lowly gravediggers. Everyone in their own way became a custodian of memory. The plague didn't just erase lives, it threatened to erase knowledge and tradition. So people clung to whatever scraps they could salvage, whether on parchment or in bone. Historically, the years after the Black Death saw a rush to preserve and copy texts. Monks who survived redoubled their efforts to copy manuscripts, often working with an intensity that left pages smudged and margins full of hasty doodles. Collectors hoarded anything that smelled of wisdom. Medical treatises, herbals, astrological charts, even old pagan writings dug up from forgotten chests. A single book could now command the value of a small farm, and in the same breath, bones became repositories of memory too. Relics of saints, fragments of ancestors, even skulls carefully arranged in charnel houses as physical proof that life went on. Here's the quirky fact. Some gravediggers who had spent the plague waist-deep in corpses turned into unofficial historians. They claimed to know which families had lost the most, which streets had collapsed, which graves belonged to the wealthy versus the poor. In Prague, one such gravedigger allegedly kept a running tally scratched into a plank of wood, boasting of his record of bodies buried. Morbid, yes, but he became a kind of local authority. People asked him for stories the way others would consult chronicles. In a twisted sense, he was an archist of mortality. Scholars still debate how much the plague accelerated the rediscovery of older texts, particularly Greek and Roman works. Was the sudden hunger for knowledge a reaction to catastrophe? The survivors tried to grasp any threat of explanation, Or was it simply part of a larger trend that would have unfolded anyway, feeding into the Renaissance, whether or not the plague happened? Some argue the trauma of mass death sparked an almost desperate urgency to remember, to not let human wisdom slip into the pit along with the bodies. Others caution that this urgency may be exaggerated by hindsight, our need to find meaning in the chaos. You leaf through one of the manuscripts in this cluttered room. The parchment is thick, uneven, the ink slightly blurred. In the margin, a doodle of a little dancing skeleton waves at you. Proof that even in their grim task, scribes found room for gallows humor. On a shelf nearby sits a stack of bones, bleached and clean, arranged with unsettling neatness. To the scribe, they are reminders. Every page copied is defiance against forgetting. Every bone stacked is proof that lives once filled these streets. Outside, you see another kind of preservation. Merchants flushed with inheritance from dead relatives are buying manuscripts to decorate their homes. They may not read a word of Latin, but they understand that books are symbols of survival, prestige, and perhaps even protection. Knowledge becomes both sacred and fashionable, and its keepers, whether scribes, monks, or collectors, become unlikely celebrities. And yet not all is noble. Some manuscripts are deliberately edited as they're recopied, with scribes inserting their own explanations for the plague. Divine wrath, planetary misalignment, corrupted air. In preserving knowledge, they also reshape it. You realize that memory itself is unstable, bending under the weight of trauma. The truth of the Black Death will be told and retold, each copy a little different, each bone rearranged with a slightly new meaning. By nightfall, the room is lit only by the soft glow of candles. The scribe bends over his parchment, lips moving silently as he traces each word. His hand trembles, not from fear, but from exhaustion. Yet he doesn't stop. Somewhere in the courtyard beyond, the gravedigger drags another sack of bones toward the ossuary, humming a low tune. Books and bones, two forms of memory, fragile, incomplete, but stubbornly refusing to vanish. When you leave the scribes and their bone-stacked archives, the streets outside feel oddly different, fuller, busier, but with new faces at the center of things. A woman in a dark veil argues with a merchant over the price of wool. Another, sleeves rolled high, barks orders at apprentices as if she's been running that workshop for decades. And at the manor edge of town, a widow with a hawk perched on her wrist inspects her fields like a seasoned landowner. This is not the medieval world you read about in children's textbooks, where women are cloistered in kitchens and sewing rooms. The Black Death, for all its devastation, left an unexpected gap, and women stepped directly into it. Historically, the plague carved out space for women in ways few other events had. With men gone in staggering numbers, widows inherited estates, shops, and guild memberships. In some cases, city councils even rewrote statutes to allow women to manage businesses that had previously been locked behind the guild wall. In Florence, widows operated textile workshops. In London, records show women taking over taverns, breweries, and even smithies. Entire industries, if only for a time, leaned on women not as silent partners but as visible leaders. Here's the quirky fact. A chronicler in Paris grumbled that women had become loud in the market and bold in the taverns, which he clearly meant as an insult. But reading between the lines, you hear the truth. Women were running things, and some men didn't like it. There's even evidence of women using new wealth to commission art or donate to churches, securing not just survival, but public legacy. Imagine a medieval widow strolling into a guild hall and dropping coins on the table like a seasoned banker, her rivals forced to nod in reluctant respect. But here's the scholarly debate. Did this newfound agency last? Some argue the post-plague era permanently shifted women's roles, opening cracks that later movements would widen. Others caution that once populations rebounded, patriarchal norms reasserted themselves, pushing women back to the margins. Was this a permanent restructuring or just a temporary detour? Historians still wrangle over it, and the answer may depend on the region. Northern Europe seemed more open to sustaining female households. Southern Europe often folded women back into restrictive systems once men returned. For you wandering these streets, the effect feels immediate and real. You see girls in apprenticeships usually reserved for boys, their hands stained with dye or soot. A woman in fine linen argues in court over a property dispute. her voice steady while a scribe scribbles furiously to keep up. Even in households, the authority has shifted. Matriarchs decide where to plant, what to sell, who to marry. And while not all women thrived, many were still crushed by poverty or remarried quickly under pressure. The sheer visibility of their presence marks a rupture. The changes even ripple into family life. Children suddenly raised by widowed mothers grow up with different models of authority, seeing women command without hesitation. Girls watching their mothers run shops or fields learn skills they never would have touched in the old order. And yes, you can sense resistance. Men muttering in taverns, priests reminding congregations about the proper order of things, but you also sense that something has shifted in memory. Even if patriarchy claws back its control, the image of women commanding, trading, and inheriting won't be forgotten. As evening settles, you pause near a textile workshop where women and girls sing as they weave. Their laughter rings out into the street, light but purposeful, like a thread stitching new patterns across the old cloth of society. In that sound, you hear both resilience and change, proof that the survivors of the plague weren't just rebuilding what was lost. They were in some ways reimagining who got to hold the tools of power. By now you've walked through graveyards, manor halls, guild streets, and markets, but nothing prepares you for the reappearance of a figure so strange he looks like he stumbled out of a nightmare. The Plague Doctor. You first spot him at a crossroads, a tall silhouette in a wide-brimmed hat and a mask shaped like a bird's beak. He carries a staff to prod patients without touching them, and the faint rustle of herbs stuffed into his mask trails him like incense. To the villagers, he's half healer, half omen, someone you both pray to see and dread when he arrives at your door. Historically, the so-called plague doctors became emblematic of the crisis, though their actual usefulness is still debated. They wore long waxed coats, gloves, and those iconic masks filled with aromatics, rosemary, lavender, cloves, believing that bad air or miasma carried the disease. Their staffs kept patients at a distance, while their records provided some of the earliest systematic accounts of outbreaks. In Venice, for example, municipal governments actually hired plague doctors on salary, giving them official roles as both healers and data collectors. Here's the quirky fact. Some of these doctors weren't doctors at all. Records show that the job was sometimes handed to second-rate physicians, barbers, or even desperate men willing to risk infection for pay. Imagine a barber who spent most of his life trimming beards, suddenly donning a beaked mask and declaring himself an expert on pestilence. In a sense, plague doctors were part healer, part bureaucrat, part performance art. Scholars still argue about their effectiveness. Some historians view plague doctors as more symbolic than practical, a comfort to communities that wanted to believe someone was doing something. Others point to their notes, some surprisingly detailed, which tracked symptoms, mortality rates, and even potential contagion patterns. These observations, however crude, nudged medicine toward empirical study, laying groundwork for public health measures centuries later. Were they quacks in costumes, or the awkward birth of epidemiology? The debate hasn't ended for you. Watching this particular plague doctor approach, the tension is unmistakable. A family ushers him inside their cottage, crossing themselves. You linger at the window and hear the scrape of his staff against the floorboards as he circles the sickbed. His mask dips close to the patient, the herbs inside muffling the stench. He scribbles something onto parchment, mutters a prayer, and taps the ground twice with his staff before leaving. The family thanks him as though he's a saint, even though he's given no medicine, just presents and procedure. Children, of course, can't resist mocking him. You pass a gaggle of them later, giggling and waddling around with sticks for staffs and paper cones strapped to their faces. To them, he's a kind of grim clown. Adults hush them quickly, eyes darting, afraid of tempting fate. But the fact remains, the plague doctor is now part of the collective imagination, both feared and parodied. By nightfall, you find the doctor again, standing by a fire where he burns soiled linens and sprinkles vinegar into the flames. He looks more like a ritualist than a healer, but there's something oddly reassuring in his repetition. The world has been reduced to uncertainty, and even a man in a bird mask offers a fragile sense of control. Whether or not he heals, He reminds people that survival still has its rituals. The bird-masked doctor fades into the smoky horizon, and as you walk deeper into the town, another sound rises. The sharp crack of hammers striking stone, the grind of carts hauling timber, the shouts of masons calling for mortar. You've arrived at the city walls, where survivors now labor not against disease, but against memory and fear. The plague may have thinned the population, but Europe still lived in a world of raids, bandits, and rival neighbors. And in the wake of the Black Death, towns took rebuilding as an opportunity to refortify, as if bricks and battlements might shield them from the invisible, as well as the visible. Historically, many cities poured resources into repairing and expanding their fortifications after the plague. Abandoned stretches of wall were patched, watchtowers refitted, and gates reinforced. Some rulers even launched ambitious building programs, framing them as both protection and renewal. In London, portions of the old Roman wall were shored up. In Italian city-states like Siena and Florence, massive projects were proposed, some completed, others left as half-finished skeletons when money or labor ran short. The walls weren't just military defenses, they were psychological ones. To stand behind stone was to feel less exposed to chaos. Here's the quirky detail. Some communities believed walls could block not only armies, but also pestilence itself. Chronicles mentioned towns digging trenches and sealing gates in hopes of keeping out bad air. One German town even placed guards at its walls, not to fight soldiers, but to sniff strangers and decide whether they smelled ill. It sounds absurd now, but to medieval minds, a sealed gate could be a shield against both sword and sickness. The scholarly debate turns on whether these construction projects were acts of resilience or desperation. Some historians argue they reflected real political strength, cities flexing their recovery, proving to rivals that they were still standing tall. Others see them as hollow gestures, empty shells that couldn't protect against plague or poverty, and that sometimes drained treasuries needed for food or rebuilding homes. Did these walls symbolize survival, or were they monuments to fear? The answer may be both. For you, standing on scaffolding alongside the masons, the walls feel like a mixture of triumph and futility. A young builder smears mortar with a grin, proud that he's earning higher wages than his father ever dreamed. Another mutts about the pointlessness of piling stone when death walks through keyholes. Below, children play among heaps of rubble, pretending to be knights defending the city. Their laughter a strange counterpoint to the weary rhythm of hammers. You notice that fortifications also serve a quieter purpose: jobs. With fields lying wild and guilds unstable, construction offers steady work. Men who once bent over plows now haul stone. Widows provide food and drink to crews, turning labor into an economy of survival. Rebuilding walls isn't just about defense. It's a social glue, a way to bind the fragments of the community back together through sweat and dust. As the day wanes, you climb a finished tower. From up here, the countryside stretches endlessly, dotted with abandoned villages and silent fields. Yet behind the wall, you see life resuming. Markets opening, children chasing geese, women hauling buckets from the well. The wall doesn't erase fear, but it frames it, giving people a boundary to live within. And as the sun dips, you understand why survivors keep stacking stone. Not because it will stop death, but because it feels like doing something. And sometimes doing something is enough to keep despair at bay. From the top of the city wall, your gaze follows the horizon toward the distant roads and rivers. They look quiet now, but you can almost hear the groan of carts and the creak of ship masts ready to stir again. Trade, the lifeblood of medieval towns, was strangled during the plague. Routes blocked, ports shuttered, caravans abandoned in the wilderness. Yet, even in the shadow of mass graves, merchants were some of the first to test the roads again. Greed, survival, and curiosity all pulled in the same direction, back toward the markets. Historically, commerce resumed surprisingly quickly. Venetian and Genoese fleets, once feared as carriers of death, began sailing again, their harbors thrumming with cautious energy. The Hanseatic League, that sprawling network of North Sea and Baltic traders, struggled with population loss, but soon reasserted itself, moving grain, cloth, and salt between cities desperate to restock. Markets reopened, though often haltingly, 1 week buzzing, The next week closed after rumors of plague in a neighboring town. Here's the quirky fact. Many traders started carrying health passports, documents stamped by local officials declaring their home city free of plague. These were medieval equivalents of vaccination cards, though usually worthless. A merchant might wave a stamped piece of parchment at a guard while his cargo of grain squirmed with plague-carrying rats. Still, people clung to them because the illusion of safety was sometimes the only way to keep business flowing. The scholarly debate here is whether trade was more of a blessing or a curse in this period. Some argue it was essential for recovery, bringing food, tools, and luxury goods to communities hollowed out by loss. Others point out it also reintroduced fear, spreading not just rumors, but occasional flare-ups of disease. Was reopening the roads an act of courage or recklessness? Historians still weigh whether Europe's resilience outweighed the risks of renewed contagion. For you, stepping into a reopened market square, the atmosphere is both festive and tense. Merchants call out from their stalls, silks from Lucca, saltfish from the Baltic, pepper from Alexandria. Yet the crowd keeps a nervous distance, eyeing foreign traders with suspicion. One woman spits on the ground after a sailor walks by, muttering about stranger's breath. The smells of roasted meat and exotic spices mingle with the stench of vinegar-soaked rags tied to stall posts, a crude attempt to purify the air. On the riverbank, a ship cacks as its crew unloads barrels. Dock workers gossip about whether it came from a plague-struck port. One insists the sailors look too healthy. Another swears he saw a rat leap from the rope onto the quay. The ship's captain waves his health passport with theatrical flair, laughing off the mutters, but you can feel the unease rippling through the crowd. Profit has returned, but so has paranoia. Yet the pull of trade is irresistible. Towns starved of resources welcome it. Survivors eager to spend their small windfalls crave it. Widows use inheritance money to buy bright cloth. Peasants with new wages taste foreign spices for the first time. The plague left empty bellies and coffers, and trade promises to fill them again. Even fear bends before the lure of cinnamon and silk. By nightfall, the market quiets, stalls shuttered, and torches flicker along the docks. A merchant sits on a barrel, counting coins with a grin, while just a few steps away a friar warns a small crowd that foreign goods carry not blessings, but curses. You realize trade has returned not as a simple lifeline, but as a gamble. Every shipment a bet between prosperity and peril. And still the wagons roll, the ships sail, because Europe has always been willing to risk its life for the chance to live better. The market stalls fade into shadows, but something else catches your eye. A sudden flash of color. Against the grey stone and brown wool of everyday survival, a young man struts past in a tunic, dyed a shocking crimson, its hems scandalously short above his knees. A woman follows in a gown lined with fur, her veil sheer enough to turn heads. The Black Death had ripped open society's fabric, and now survivors are stitching it back together with brighter, bolder threads. Fashion has become both a rebellion and a proclamation. I lived. Historically, clothing did shift after the plague, and not just because so many wardrobes were suddenly up for grabs. With laborers demanding higher wages and fewer mouths left to inherit wealth, survivors often had more money to spend on luxuries. Taylor experimented with shorter tunics for men, tighter bodices for women, and an explosion of color that shocked the conservative old guard. The sumptu laws, those endless medieval rules about who could wear what, were suddenly impossible to enforce. When half the nobility is gone, who's left to stop a peasant from strutting around in velvet? Here's the quirky detail. Some chroniclers fumed that survivors dressed with indecent gaiety, as though the plague had unleashed not piety, but vanity. In Florence, men were accused of slashing their sleeves to show off expensive linings, a trend so ridiculous it caught on across Europe. In England, shoes became absurdly long and pointy, so long that nobles tied the tips to their knees with chains. Imagine surviving the deadliest pandemic in history, then immediately deciding, yes, what I need now are clown shoes that double as trip hazards. Scholars debate what this saratoral explosion really meant. Was it simple indulgence, the human urge to enjoy life after staring into the grave? Or was it a deeper social statement, a way for peasants and merchants to blur class lines by adopting styles once reserved for elites? Some argue the plague democratized fashion. Survivors flaunted what they could afford, not what they were allowed. Others counter that elites quickly reasserted control, inventing new, stricter sumptuary laws to shove people back into visible hierarchies. Either way, clothing became a battlefield of identity in the years after the plague. You walk through a street where tailors' shops are bustling. Bolts of bright cloth spill out of doorways. Greens, blues, yellows, so vivid they make the drab earth tones of pre-plague life look funereal. A widow with silver coins jingling in her purse commissions a gown trimmed with sable, daring the council to stop her. Apprentices laugh as they stitch flamboyant hats with feathers that bob like ruers' combs. The air smells of dvats and ambition. Not everyone approves. You overhear a friar scolding a group of youths for wasting money on vanity instead of arms. The boys roll their eyes, tugging their short tunics higher just to spite him. Across the square, an elderly woman shakes her head, muttering that such fashions invite another round of divine punishment. But for the younger survivors, fashion isn't sin. It's survival in another form, proof that death didn't take their appetite for joy. By evening, as torches flare, you watch a group of revelers strut through the streets and clothed so bright they almost glow in the firelight. Their laughter is loud, perhaps too loud, as though they're trying to drown out the silence that still haunts the alleys. You realize these garments are more than fabric. They're armor made of color, stitched with defiance, worn as a promise that life, however precarious, still demands to be celebrated in full view. The revelers in their bright tunics fade into the night. But as dawn creeps over the rooftops, another transformation comes into focus. On a wall near the marketplace, a mural appears. Skeletal figures dancing hand in hand with peasants, nobles, even kings. The paint is fresh. The outlines rough but powerful. You stop and stare. This isn't decoration. It's testimony. Art has shifted, no longer content with saints glowing in gilded frames. After the Black Death, creativity itself seems to crack open, haunted by memory yet reaching for something new. Historically, art after the plague bore deep scars. Churches commissioned fresco of the dance macabre, the dance of death, where skeletons mocked the living by tugging them into the grave. Painters filled canvases with grotesque images of rotting flesh, while sculptors carved cadavers, lying side by side with saints. Yet alongside this morbid obsession came renewal. Survivors began to invest in art as a form of commemoration, commissioning altarpieces, chapels, and portraits to honor families who barely survived. Some historians see this as the pivot that carried Europe from medieval rigidity toward Renaissance expression. Here's the quirky fact. In Lübeck, Germany, an entire mural of the Dance of Death stretched across a cloister wall, so vivid that locals joked skeletons would slip off the plaster at night to join the living. The work became a kind of civic attraction, both horrifying and irresistible. Parents even brought children to gawk as if to say, "See, even emperors end up bones. Eat your bread and be grateful." But scholars wrestle with the meaning of this artistic shift. Was it purely a reflection of trauma? Grim reminders that death spares no one? Or was it an early step toward a more human-centered art, where ordinary lives mattered enough to be painted alongside saints? Some argue the Black Death was the shock therapy that loosened art from strict theological chains, encouraging experimentation in realism and emotion. Others caution that the Renaissance was already gestating, and plague art was just a morbid detour before the real flowering. For you wandering through the town, the effect is overwhelming. You pass a chapel where stained glass glows with new intensity, colors deeper, faces more expressive. In a workshop, an artist mixes pigments, muttering about how to capture both decay and beauty on a single panel. He shows you a half-finished Madonna, whose eyes are red-rimmed with sorrow, unlike the serene, untouchable figures of old. In another corner, a sculptor chisels a tomb effigy of a nobleman, but instead of a serene sleeper, he carves him as a decayed corpse, worms nibbling at the stone ribs. It's grotesque, yet somehow honest. And yet there's joy, too. Children chalk skeletons on walls, not in fear, but in play, turning the imagery of death into a kind of carnival. Survivors with new wealth order portraits of themselves, not as saints in waiting, but as flesh and blood humans dressed in vivid gowns and bright hats. Art is no longer only for the eternal, it's also for the here and now. By evening, you stand before another mural, this one newer and stranger. Not skeletons, but farmers harvesting golden fields under a clear blue sky. a vision of abundance. It feels almost like a prayer painted, not with words but with color. The plague's shadow lingers in every line, yet so does the determination to make beauty rise from ruin. And as the torches flicker against the wall, you realize that in brushstrokes and chisels, survivors are sketching not just their grief, but their stubborn hope. The murals linger in your mind, but as you drift down another crooked lane, a different sound takes hold. Music. Not the polished chants of monasteries, but raw human voices rising from doorways and taverns, carried on the night air. You pause at the edge of a courtyard where a group of survivors gather, their songs low and mournful at first, then swelling into something almost defiant. In the wake of the Black Death, music has become both a memorial and a lifeline. Half lament, half survival strategy. Historically, Plague-era Europe saw music bend and reshape itself. Church choirs thinned to whispers as died or fled, but communities stitched new songs together out of grief. Dirges multiplied, weaving sorrow into melody. Ballads spread by word of mouth, recounting villages lost, lovers separated, and the cruel randomness of death. Folk traditions, long overshadowed by clerical dominance, found new space to flourish. Survivors who couldn't read scripture could still sing, and through singing, they preserved stories of both loss and endurance. Here's the quirky fact. Some towns employed plague pipers, whose job was literally to play music during burials, hoping that tunes would soothe both mourers and restless spirits. Chroniclers complained that the pipers sometimes turned rowdy, leading to funerals that felt more like drunken festivals. Imagine standing by a mass grave while someone belts out a tune on bagpipes that sounds suspiciously upbeat. It blurred the line between mourning and mockery, but maybe that was the point. Laughter and grief had become inseparable. The scholarly debate centers on whether the Black Death really altered Europe's musical trajectory or simply amplified existing trends. Some argue that the trauma shifted music toward more emotional, expressive forms, setting the stage for later Renaissance compositions. Others insist the impact was overstated, that most innovations came from courtly or liturgical traditions already underway. What's clear, however, is that folk music, those songs of fields, hearths, and taverns, gained a new urgency. When half your world disappears, the need to sing your story becomes impossible to suppress. You watch a circle of villagers singing a call and response ballad, their voices rough but harmonized. The lyrics tell of a harvest abandoned, of lovers promising to meet again when the bells stop tolling. Children hum along, not fully grasping the sorrow embedded in the tune, but carrying it anyway. Music here isn't just art. It's inheritance, a way of making sure grief doesn't dissolve into silence. At the same time, new rhythms creep in. With trade routes reopening, instruments and styles travel farther than before. You overhear a merchant boasting that he brought back a nude from the Levant. It sounds strange but mesmerizing. Another fiddler experiments with faster tempos, his bow dancing as if to chase away despair. The contrast is jarring. On one corner, a widow keens a dirge. On the next, youth stomp their feet to a lively jig that dares the darkness to keep up. By nightfall, the town square transforms into a gathering place. Torches burn, mugs clink, and music swells louder. No longer just mourning, but celebration. You realize that this too is a survival tactic. If people can sing together, whether in grief or joy, they are less likely to feel alone. The plague tried to silence Europe, but in every wailing dirge and drunken ballad, the survivors answer back. We are still here and we still have voices. The echoes of song still hum in your ears, when weeks later you find yourself swept into something louder, brighter, and almost dizzying. A festival. The same streets that once smelled of ash and despair now ring with laughter, clatter, and the clanging of bells tied to dancers' ankles. Survivors tired of mourning have decided to throw their grief into the air like confetti. Everywhere you look, people wear garlands of flowers, masks painted with grins, and clothes and colors so bright they almost hurt your eyes. This is not denial, it's rebellion. The Black Death tried to drown joy, and Europe answers with carnivals that burn twice as hot as before. Historically, festivals and public rituals surged in the wake of the plague. Towns hosted carnivals, pageants, and feast days with renewed intensity. Religious calendars were thick with saints' days, but post-plague survivors twisted them into hybrid events, half worship, half unrestrained revelry. In Florence, the feast of San Giovanni turned into an explosion of parades, music, and fireworks. In England, May Day celebrations spread with new vigor, villagers dancing around poles as if daring the earth itself to remember fertility. Even processions of penitents blurred into carnivals, self-flagellants marching, while crowds of children mocked them, turning solemnity into theatre. Here's the quirky fact. In some towns, people actually staged mock funerals for the plague itself. Coffins were paraded through streets, filled not with bodies but with straw effigies labeled death, then ceremoniously burned. Imagine watching a community boo and jeer as a scarecrow in a shroud is set to light, the crowd cheering as if they just defeated the Grim Reaper in a wrestling match. The scholarly debate circles around whether these festivals were acts of healing or of distraction. Some historians argue they were psychological necessities, structured ways of processing grief through laughter, dancing, and excess. Others see them as pressure valves, sanctioned chaos that prevented uprisings by giving the poor a taste of freedom. Were these carnivals genuine joy, or cleverly tolerated eruptions to keep people docile? The answer, as always, probably lies somewhere between. A little healing, a little control, a lot of noise. You wander through one such carnival now. A troupe of masked performers tumbles across the cobblestones, juggling apples until one bursts in a sticky spray. Children shriek with laughter. A man dressed as a skeleton chases a group of maidens who squeal before turning and chasing him back. Musicians pound drums and blow horns, their rhythm relentless. Even the clergy get in on the act, sponsoring processions with relics before quietly slipping off to watch jugglers with the rest of the crowd. There's an undercurrent, though. Some survivors dance as if trying to outrun memories. You see a woman whirl until she collapses, breathless and weeping, her friends pulling her back to her feet with shouts of encouragement. Others drink until their laughter tips into manic howls. The festival feels both jubilant and haunted, joy edged with desperation. But maybe that's the point. Laughter isn't the absence of grief. It's survival in its shadow. As night falls, bonfires roar in the square. People throw herbs into the flames, the smoke carrying prayers or maybe just superstition into the sky. Couples slip into the shadows. Children chase sparks, and old men toast to the fact they're still alive. You sit at the edge of the firelight, watching faces glow orange and realize this. The festivals aren't just about forgetting the plague. They're about daring to remember and then dancing. Anyway, the fires of the carnival smolder down to ash, and when the dawn smoke clears, you find yourself in a quieter chamber, one that smells of herbs, ink, and something sour. This is no marketplace or festival ground, but the workshop of a physician, cluttered with jars of dried plants, astrological charts pinned to the walls, and half-burnt candles dripping onto grimy tables. After the Black Death, medicine was forced to rethink itself. The old explanations, bad humors, divine wrath, poisoned air, suddenly seemed flimsy when they failed so spectacularly. You watch survivors grope for new answers, balancing on the thin line between superstition and science. Historically, the plague was a hammer blow to medieval medicine. Traditional physicians leaned on Galen and Aristotle, insisting that imbalance in the four humors caused illness, but their remedies, bloodletting, purging, endless syrups, had done little. Survivors didn't forget that failure. Some physicians began questioning old authorities, experimenting with observation and trial. In Italy, scholars like Guidoliac recorded detailed notes of symptoms and survival rates, shaping early epidemiology. In Montpellier and Padua, universities revised curricula to include more practical anatomy and bot. The plague didn't cure medicine's flaws, but it jolted it toward change. Here's the quirky fact. One French town hired an official sniffer whose job was to detect plague by smell. He claimed he could identify the sickness by its odor before symptoms appeared. Whether he was a fraud or simply had a strong nose, the post made him both respected and feared. Imagine your reputation hinging on how accurately you can say, "Yes, that peasant smells like death." The scholarly debate asks whether the Black Death really marked a turning point or just nudged medicine along a pre-existing track. Some argue it accelerated empirical study by forcing doctors to record, compare, and adapt instead of blindly quoting ancient texts. Others counter that superstition remained dominant. Astrology, charms, and bloodletting persisted well into the 15th century. Was the plague a medical revolution or just another stumble toward one? The answer, like a physician's diagnosis, depends on which case you study. For you seated in the corner of this workshop, the mix is striking. On one shelf sit jars of dried sage, and rosemary believed to cleanse the air. On another rests a dissected pig, its organs carefully labeled as stand-ins for human anatomy. The physician scratches notes furiously, glancing between his patient and the heavens, as if equally convinced by observation and the stars. A mother waits anxiously, while he prescribes both a puss of ground herbs and a prayer to St. Roch hedging bets with both science and sanctity. And medicine isn't confined to physicians. Midwives, herbalists, and even gravediggers continue to shape local practice. A village woman sells charms woven from garlic and nettles, swearing they repel pestilence. Another boils willow bark for fevers, her remedies quietly effective even if dismissed by scholars. In the cracks of official medicine, folk knowledge thrives, passed along in whispers and recipes. By nightfall, you walk past a line of patients waiting at the physician's door. Some hold coins, others barter with chickens or cloth. They don't care whether his cures come from Galen, herbs, or the constellations. They care that he's alive, present, and trying. In a world where answers dissolved alongside the old order, medicine is less about certainty than persistence. Every herb mixed, every chart drawn, every experiment scribbled is a declaration. We're not giving up on life just yet. The physician's cluttered workshop fades behind you, and soon you're standing in the echoing hall of a council chamber. The air is heavy with parchment, wax seals, and the faint stink of too many men sweating under woolen cloaks. The plague has left not just fields and homes in ruins, but also laws. With half the population gone, rulers scramble to rewrite the rules that once kept feudal Europe glued together. Statutes, decrees, ordinances. Everywhere you look, the ink is still drying. You can practically hear the sound of authority, trying to reassert itself through scribbled words. Historically, the most famous example was England's Statute of Labourers in 1351, a desperate attempt to freeze wages at pre-plague levels and stop workers from wandering off for better deals. Similar laws appeared across Europe, restricting peasants' movement, inheritance rights, and wages. Monarchs and city councils worried not just about economics, but about losing control. The plague cracked open possibilities, and governments rushed to slam the door shut again. Here's the quirky fact. In Milan, officials passed laws about how many mourners could attend a funeral. Not because they cared about grief, but because they worried funerals were turning into rowdy social gatherings. One chronicler grumbles that widows dressed too gay at processions, catching new husbands before the old bodies had cooled. So the council decided to legislate mourning as if sorrow could be neatly filed alongside taxes. The scholarly debate asks whether these new laws were actually effective or just wishful thinking. Some argue they tightened social order, proving that government still had teeth even after catastrophe. Others insist most people ignored them. Peasants laughed at wage caps, workers still wandered, and families bent inheritance rules to their advantage. Were these laws a genuine reshaping of society, or simply paper shields waved by desperate rulers? Historians remain divided, pointing to evidence of both enforcement and defiance. For you watching the council at work, the tension is obvious. One scribe reads aloud a decree demanding that no man may demand wages above his station. A farmer in the back mutters that he'll ignore it. Fields won't plough themselves, and lords will pay when desperate. Another decree bans inheritance disputes without the bishop's approval. But outside, widows are already fighting tooth and nail over property. Legal parchment be damned. The ink dries faster than obedience, yet not all the laws are futile. You hear about new ordinances requiring towns to clean streets more regularly, to burn waste, to keep butchers outside city walls. These measures, though crude, lay the groundwork for future public health policy. Some statutes reorganize trade routes, rebuild bridges, and regulate grain prices. It's messy, inconsistent, but it shows a society trying to learn from catastrophe rather than simply collapse under it. By the time the council session ends, the chamber smells of extinguished candles and stale promises. The lords and clerks shuffle out, robes trailing while peasants outside jostle to see what new burdens or opportunities have just been proclaimed. You realize that laws like walls aren't just about control. They're about reassurance. They tell survivors that someone somewhere still holds the pen of order. Whether anyone listens is another matter entirely. You step out of the council chamber expecting calm, but the streets outside buzz with something sharper. It's not the hum of markets or the chants of priests. It's anger. Men and women gather in clusters, their voices rising above the clatter of hooves. Pitchforks lean against walls. Scythes rest on shoulders, and the look in their eyes is a mix of exhaustion and fury. The new laws tried to press survivors back into their old roles, but many have tasted leverage and refused to let it go. You realize you're standing at the edge of a peasant uprising. Historically, the decades after the Black Death were marked by waves of revolt. In 1358, the French countryside erupted in the Jacquerie, where peasants burned manors and slaughtered nobles in revenge for exploitation. In 1381, England saw the peasants' revolt led by Wat Tyler, demanding fair wages, lower taxes, and an end to serfdom. Similar rebellions fled in Italy, Flanders, and Germany. The plague had thinned the ranks of authority, and survivors recognized the imbalance. For once they had numbers on their side, and their anger carried the heat of generations. Here's the quirky fact. During the English Revolt, rebels stormed into London and actually sat on the king's throne in the Tower, laughing and feasting before torching records of feudal obligations. Imagine peasants, mud still on their boots, lounging in the royal seat while clerks panicked around them. For a fleeting moment, the old hierarchy was literally upside down. Scholars argue about the true roots of these uprisings. Were they born directly out of plague trauma, or were they more about long-simmering resentment over taxes, war, and feudal restrictions? Some say the Black Death was the spark that lit a pre-prepared pile of dry wood. Others insist it fundamentally changed class relations, emboldening peasants with the knowledge that society couldn't function without them. Either way, the revolt showed that Europe's social order was shakier than it had ever admitted. You walk among the rebels now. Their voices rise in chants, not polished or poetic, but raw. We will not starve. We will not kneel. An old man brandishes a hoe like a sword, while a boy clutches a stolen helmet that's far too big for him. Women march beside them, some carrying baskets of stones, others pulling carts of bread to feed the crowd. This isn't just a riot. It's a movement fueled by grief, hunger, and the intoxicating taste of possibility. The authorities, of course, panic. Troops assemble, banners rise, and rumors swirl that knights are already riding out to teach the peasants their place. The town around you trembles with tension, shutters bang shut, priests whisper prayers, and merchants hide their coin chests. You can feel the air before the storm, charged and brittle. When the clash finally comes, it's brutal. The rebels surge with anger. Overwhelming guards torching a manor, ripping ledgers from clerks' hands. But soon armored knights crash into the crowd. Steel against wood, discipline against desperation. Screams split the air. A boy who just hours ago wore a stolen helmet now lies trampled in the mud. The revolt burns bright, then flickers under the weight of swords. By nightfall, the square is quiet again, but the silence feels different from the early days of the plague. It's not resignation, it's simmering. Even crushed, the memory of rebellion lingers. Survivors have learned that authority can be challenged even if victory slips away. In the ashes of this uprising, you sense the faint pulse of something enduring. The idea that peasants were no longer faceless labor, but a force that rulers would never again fully ignore. The mud of revolt still clings to your boots as you wander back into the quieter edges of town. The shouting crowds are gone, but in their place is a subtler hum. Whispers of charms, the clink of amulets, and the rustle of parchment covered in star charts. For all the new laws, new wages, and new rebellions, the plague left behind one stubborn habit: people clinging to strange remedies. If medicine was still fumbling in the dark, then why not try garlic necklaces, crystal spheres, or prayers to the alignment of Jupiter and Mars? You find yourself in a world where reason and superstition sit side by side, bickering like siblings. Historically, the years after the Black Death saw a surge in alternative cures. Amulets filled with dried herbs dangled from children's necks. Astrologers claimed to predict outbreaks by charting the heavens, while alchemists hawked potions promising protection. Some towns even employed wise women, or local charm makers who prescribed remedies, involving everything from frog parts to recited chants. The church frowned, but desperation outweighed doctrine. Survivors would try anything if it meant keeping death away. Here's the quirky fact. One popular charm involved carrying a dead toad around in a pouch. The logic went like this: a toad could suck the plague's poison from the body. People swore by it, though the only certain result was a terrible stink. Another remedy urged drinking one's own urine, justified by the belief that what left the body might rebalance it. Picture a family at supper, half joking, half serious, debating whether to raise a toast with wine, or something far less pleasant. Were these cures mere folly or a kind of proto-science? Some scholars call charms in astrology pure distraction. Others note that many prescriptions blended herbs with mild antiseptic or pain-dulling effects. Even astrology wasn't only hocus-pocus. It was a flawed system for organizing observations. Gullible, or experimenting in the only language they had. The line blurs. You duck into a dim shop where shelves sag with jars of dried plants, symbol-etched stones, and scrolls of planetary charts. The shopkeeper, sharp-eyed, presses a sachet of rue and wormwood into your hand, swearing it wards off foul air. A brass astrolabe glints on the counter. She traces constellations, murmuring predictions for the coming season. Outside, a father knots a talisman of chicken bones to his child's wrist and whispers a prayer. And you notice something. These practices don't always oppose medicine or faith. They braid together. A physician writes a pulse prescription and a charm. A priest blesses relics while villagers still consult the stars. Survivors aren't guarding categories, they're chasing survival. If one thing fails, they stack another on top until the ritual itself feels like armor. By night, you sit by a hearth as a charm said to belong to a saint passes from hand to hand. Each person touches it, eyes shut as if drawing strength. Placebo or hope? Maybe it doesn't matter. After so much death, belief itself becomes a medicine, fragile, stubborn, necessary. You leave with the scent of herbs and toad charms in your clothes, and the road opens onto something different. A small green where children chase one another in the fading light. Their laughter jars after riots and funerals. These are the plague's children, growing in a world rebuilt by loss and oddly rich with opportunity. Skinned knees, high voices, futures branching in ways their parents never imagined. Demographically, the aftermath produced a youthquake. With so many adults gone, children inherited land, wealth, and duty early. Records show minors owning entire manors, guardians scrambling to manage estates until they came of age. Apprenticeships opened faster. Guild ladders shortened. Adulthood accelerated. For some, tragedy created opportunity. For others, it loaded small shoulders with crushing weight. Here's the quirky bit. Labor was so scarce that even children were courted. Chroniclers grumbled that 12-year-old boys swaggered like journeymen, demanding wages. Girls barely in their teens hired as servants for more than their mothers once earned. Imagine pre-teens bragging about contracts, while adults mutter that the world has tipped upside down. What legacy did these plague-born carry forward? Some historians see a bolder, freer cohort, unbound by rigid custom. Others warn that trauma shadowed them. Orphans haunted by carts of corpses and empty homes. Seeds of renewal or a generation scarred? Both truths fit. You pause to watch a game that mimics a funeral procession. One child playing the skeleton, the others shrieking with delighted fear. Macabre but real laughter. Horror alchemized into play. Down the lane, older kids juggle apples, copying last festival's performers. Their world stitches grief and joy into everyday games. At home, the weight is plain. A boy of 15 signs papers with a steward, lord of the manor now quill trembling between pride and dread. A girl balances her baby brother on one hip while haggling for grain. Childhood, as we imagine it, barely exists. Survival demands speed, and they rise to it. Evening falls, fires bloom, shadows lengthen, and the children still play, voices ringing like bells. They don't remember the before the way their elders do. Their memories are forged in aftermath, not collapse. They aren't just surviving ruins. They're normalizing them, turning pockmarked streets into playgrounds, making tomorrow less haunted. Their games flirt with death. Their laughter insists on life. The laughter fades behind you and something in the air changes. Grief, anger, bargaining, ghosts. They braid into a larger tide. Not a single event, but a slow swell. In catastrophe's wake, survivors plant seeds that will grow into a new era. The Black Death tore Europe apart. From the rift rises a jagged momentum we later call the Renaissance. Walking these streets, you can feel its pulse underfoot. No, the decades after didn't glitter at once. Towns stayed empty. Fields ran wild. Fear of return hung low. Yet renewal shimmered. Battered universities widened their curricula. Mathematics, astronomy, philosophy. Merchants, newly wealthy by inheritance, poured coin into chapels, art, and libraries. City councils funded hospitals and town halls. symbols of resilience and real attempts to improve life. Quirky detail. Some Italian city-states rebuilt with lotteries, medieval scratch-offs. Citizens bought tickets. Winners claimed prizes. The surplus paid for walls, bridges, fountains. A parchment slip might get you a barrel of wine or a paved street. Did the plague cause the Renaissance or merely speed it? Opinions diverge. Some argue upheaval made innovation inevitable. Scarcer labor meant higher wages. Inheritance redistributed wealth. Disillusionment sparked new inquiry. Others say the Italian city-states were already inventive. The plague delayed as much as it accelerated. In that view, the Renaissance grew despite catastrophe, not from it. For you, the signs are undeniable. In one workshop, an artist toys with perspective, streets stretching into believable depth. In another, a scholar pores over a newly translated Aristotle and argues that observation might outrank authority. Market stalls buzz not only over cloth and spice, but pigments, marble, glass. Creativity hums beneath the haggling. You wander a new hospital, sharp with vinegar and herbs, primitive by any measure, revolutionary in intent, organized care. Across town, a library opens to scholars and curious citizens alike. In the square, a new fountain throws clean water into the dusk, funded by the same council that once tried to freeze wages. Fear's remnants are being mortared into possibility. At sunset, you climb a hill. Below, walls patched with fresh stone, markets braided with caravans, children weaving between stalls, painters setting skeletons, dancing with saints. Messy, contradictory, haunted and alive. Millions died. Life roars back anyway. The plague's scars never truly heal, but the world has cracked open, and light pours through. Hammers, laughter, prayers, song, threaded together into something unmistakable. Not mere recovery, but transformation. Survivors didn't rebuild the old world. They built the one they needed next. Fragile yet fierce, stitched with memory, defiance, and hope. They don't have a word for it yet. You do, Renaissance. And that's where our walk through plague-shadowed Europe comes to rest. We've moved through silent streets and lime-dusted pits, across feral fields and into halls where wages, laws, and whispers remade society. We've seen peasants bargain, women step forward, children turn death into play, artists set bones waltzing in paint. It was chaotic, brutal, and deeply human. Out of that chaos, something new took root. The story of the Black Death is not only about dying, it's about what follows. Survivors were not passengers. They were builders, rebels, jokers, mourners, dreamers. They carried scars and tools, brushes, songs, stubborn hope. They didn't restore the world that fell. They made the one that could stand. In doing so, they set currents running that would shape the modern age. So sit back and consider that old rhythm. Grief, then rebuilding. Fear, then laughter. Collapse, then creation. We are fragile, endlessly. We are resourceful, relentlessly. When the ground splits, we seed the cracks. When silence falls, we sing. When walls come down, we raise new ones, sometimes sturdier, sometimes stranger, always beating with the same defiant pulse of life. As you drift towards sleep, let that hum of resilience blanket you. Picture markets glowing with new cloth, walls rising from rubble, music under torchlight, children laughing in fields once abandoned. From ruin, life insists on returning. From death, history insists on continuing. From silence, we always find a song. Take a moment to let go of everything around you. Close your eyes gently. Inhale deeply. Feel your chest rise. Hold it for a second, and now slowly exhale. Let your shoulders drop. Let your body soften. With every breath, you are drifting into calm. Nothing else matters right now. Just your breath, your peace, your stillness.